Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, because my wife has very frankly told me that I'm not the shouter that I used to be. And so she keeps telling me to speak up. I'll try to do that. And thank you, David, for that very kind invitation. The book was School Wars, not Class War. Karl Marx had a copyright on class war. So, so what I'd like to talk about today is teaching from the Stone Age to artificial intelligence, and that may seem like from when you started teaching to today. And you're not far wrong. Those of us now of retirement age have lived through some of the most dramatic changes education has ever seen. And I know I'm not the only teacher to retire while mumbling, "What the hell was that all about?" When I started teaching in 1967, high tech in education was the overhead projector and the didograph. Before I left teaching, I was designing online courses and writing a textbook on how to write for the websites. I retired in 2008, just in time, before the iPhone hit the classrooms and meetings of the RTA. And now our young colleagues are wrestling with AI in all its complications. I'll come back to AI, but first I want to talk a little about my post-teaching retirement. It's been said that going to college seriously interferes with your own reading, and so does teaching. Once I was safely retired, I started reading a lot. I was beginning to look for writers with a different take on both history and the present. The history I'd been brought up on didn't explain how half a century of ever-expanding education in North America could have resulted in the early 21st century as we have experienced it. So I found writers like Kurt Anderson, whose book Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America, documented the neoliberal takeover of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. And just about the time that the Bennett Socreds and the Van der Zams were taking over here. That explains a lot about why education was so chronically underfunded, because the neoliberals didn't want public institutions in general to succeed. Then I read The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitabh Ghosh, which traced the origins of capitalism to the trade policies of Jan Pieterszoon Goen, who worked for the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. His thesis was that there is no trade without war and no war without trade, and everything had a price. I also read Ghosh's other book, Smoke and Ashes, about the opium trade in China and how it became the foundation of some of the greatest American fortunes. That was me. There are 26 towns in the United States named Canton, because Canton in the 19th century was where young men out to make a career for themselves showed up, sold a hell of a lot of opium to the Chinese, and learned from the Chinese how to enjoy it, how to enjoy the wealth that they were making. So essentially, Canton was the big time for that generation. And I read David Graeber and David Wengrow's remarkable book, The Dawn of Everything, which invites us to consider that our Stone Age ancestors were just as smart as we are, and probably smarter. Moreover, Graeber and Wengrow argue that we weren't just generic hunters and gatherers, trotting over the tundra, tossing spears at mammoths. Instead, we have lived in so many different kinds of society, from authoritarian horror shows to egalitarian democracies, long before writing was ever devised. And that led me to think about my own education in 1940s California. The history we were taught started with Christopher Columbus and segued rapidly to the triumph of Europe over peoples of which we knew little and cared less. They were savages whose function was to bite the dust when shot off their horses by the brave pioneers sheltered behind their circled wagons. I recall learning in grade 3 or 4 about the Yangna, a tribe living in the Los Angeles region who came under the control of Spanish priests working in the California mission system. But I didn't learn their fate until I was retired when I read a book called Eternity Street about the early days of Los Angeles. It mentioned in passing that the Yangna were allowed to get drunk on Saturdays, then they were arrested and auctioned off as slave labor for the rest of the week. Then they'd be released on Saturday, allowed to get drunk again, and go through the whole thing again. The Yangna effectively vanished in an 1862 smallpox epidemic that raged up and down the West Coast. Here in BC, a third of the 60,000 indigenous people living on the coast died of smallpox within a year or two. Well, why hadn't we learned that in school? Very simple. Doing so would have turned us from the heroes of our own story to the villains in an indigenous tragedy. 75 years later, the Trump government is busily whitewashing the facts we know about American history, trying to take Americans back to a sanitized mythology I was taught. Now, one effect of mythology is that it doesn't encourage close analysis of mythic figures. They're gods or demons or superhumans, simplified for storytelling purposes. And the effect of the mythology I learned in school all those decades ago was that I didn't really think much about the pre-literate people who preceded us. The real action, the real interest was in the farming peoples who developed writing to support a modern hierarchical state, complete with kings, priests, and warriors. Writing was the big breakthrough that permitted the creation of modern states. It enabled rulers to assess their own resources and to allocate them to ensure the strength of the state. That required a literate class, and that required education. You know who invented the first classroom? The Sumerians, 4,000 years ago. They invented the first classroom as an administratively convenient way to teach groups of children. Other agricultural states, like those of China, seem to have independently invented the classroom for similar reasons. And it's interesting to think that in 4,000 years, we have not really improved on the classroom. And that led me to ask myself a question. If the Sumerians and the Chinese taught children using methods that we would recognize, what did the pre-literate peoples do? One thing we know about the Stone Age peoples is that their surviving technologies in the form of spears, arrowheads, blades, and axes were remarkably conservative. A single style of arrowhead, for example, could be found in sites dated many centuries apart. Then that style would vanish and another would take its place, perhaps introduced by a new people. And we tend to look down on these slow-changing technologies because we're accustomed to new technologies, transforming our lives and what we wear in our hip pockets every few years. But to create a single style of arrowhead or spear point, generation after generation, implies extraordinarily good education. And that, in turn, implies people endowed with high intelligence, excellent language skills, and near photographic memories. Even the smallest hunter-gatherer group would have had a full stock of stories, songs, mythologies, and heads full of useful knowledge acquired from parents and relatives. They would have spent days and nights talking, laughing, grieving, talking shop, debating, quarreling. And as a general rule, natural selection would have favored the articulate, the observant, and the good explainers. Now I can imagine a young woman in her late teens, early 20s, a skilled hunter. taking her 2 boy cousins to find a reliable outcrop of flint. She shows them how to identify a promising chunk of rock, how to break it off, and then how to chip flakes off it. She keeps up a running commentary as she fashions a spear point and challenges the boys to do the same. Clumsily, they chip their first crude points, then break more stones to practice on. She encourages them, very likely with easy-to-remember songs or chants about technique. The cousins listen attentively, memorize the songs and chants, and their next points are better. They can take endless hours to practice because the adult spear points are good enough to keep them well fed, and good hunters enjoy great prestige and authority. The cousins dream of acquiring such status and keep practicing while listening to the adults as they talk around the campfire about how to choose the right stick for a shaft, how to butcher prey, how to preserve the hide, and use hand axes or blades to dismember the carcass. By the time the cousins are young men, their mentor may be dead, but they have learned all she had to teach them, and they are now hunters the group can rely on. They are also reliable teachers, teaching their children as they themselves were taught. At night around the campfire, they talk about their aunt, the great huntress, and how well she fed her people. The children listen and remember. In a few generations, she will be a goddess to whom hunters pray for success. The more I've learned about the pre-literate peoples, the more it's clear that they were in general highly intelligent, highly articulate, and good listeners. Their memories were excellent and they were very observant. Some at least must have been able to do complex mathematics in their heads, and they could operate not just in little hunter-gatherer bands, but in elaborate agricultural societies as well. So someone in Mexico, 9,000 years ago, noticed a little grassy plant called teosinte and thought it might be a more useful food if they could just tinker with it a little bit. So they cultivated it through generations, passing their knowledge to their children around the campfire. And eventually they produced what we now know as corn or maize. We are the unwitting beneficiaries of generations of ancient Mexican genetic engineers. Or consider Poverty Point in Louisiana. It's an enormous system of earthworks built between 1700 BCE and 1100 BCE, 6 centuries. Something induced the hunter-gatherers living along the Mississippi River to gather in what is now Louisiana and build a kind of settlement and ceremonial center. Whatever they got from it, it seems to have carried from generation to generation. Each generation evidently thought it was worthwhile work and brought up the next generation to continue it. And they came from way up the Mississippi too. It wasn't just the locals. They traveled there yearly to work on the earthworks. As a functioning culture, Poverty Point seems to have collapsed at about the same time Troy fell. And here's an example from Canada. In 1988, archaeologists were working in downtown Winnipeg in an area known as the Forks. 2 elders approached the archaeologists and told them the site was famous for an event in the year 1285. A drought had been afflicting much of central North America, and that had led to damaging wars between the peoples. So a conference was called, involving at least 10,000 people from 9 different cultures, all around the Great Lakes, the upper Mississippi, and so forth. And in the year 1285, when King Edward I was on the throne of England, they had met at the Forks to work out a peace treaty. The archaeologists went to work at the site, and they found pottery shards from 9 distinctive indigenous cultures, dated to just the time the elders said the conference had taken place. The story had then been handed down for 700 years, an example of how pre-literate peoples operating in multiple languages could convene and conduct an international conference and bring it to a successful conclusion. I could go on, but I hope I made my point. Pre-literate societies were skilled at teaching and learning. The arrival of Europeans, especially in the Americas, was a catastrophe. European diseases like smallpox and measles spread on indigenous trade routes, far ahead of the Europeans themselves. The high fatality rates shattered indigenous communities, depriving the survivors of the practical knowledge and political wisdom that had passed down through the generations. The agricultural societies of Asia and the Middle East, meanwhile, had been shaping themselves into something like modern states. The sheer numbers of people that could be supported by farming required a small class of accountants and record keepers to keep track of food supplies, taxes, and men available for military service. The accountants were often priests, acting with divine authority to determine the bottom line. Someone had to educate that class. And that's where classrooms in Sumeria and China come in. They created a literate managerial class to help run a hierarchical society, and no better way has emerged in 4,000 years. Most societies since then have done the same, expanding formal education to meet the needs of church and state. And not until the 19th century was the idea of free public education actually adopted in North America. Of course, you know, in England, public schools are by definition private schools like Eton. And right from the start, public education was seen as a path to social mobility. Public education turned out to be kind of a virtuous cycle. Literate kids created a demand for printed news and entertainment. Even the penny dreadfuls and dime novels of the late 19th century offered thrills and interesting ideas to young people who could read them. And strikingly, print also encouraged the rebirth of oral culture. It had never really gone away, but it was the culture of the lower classes. Huckleberry Finn is a kind of homage to that culture. Huckleberry's pap is a foul-tempered illiterate, and Huckleberry's language is no better than his. But Huckleberry shows that the American oral vernacular is capable of creating a detailed and nuanced narrative. As well, oral culture flourished in the middle classes. Popular writers like Charles Dickens published their novels first in installments, and when the latest installment arrived on a ship from Britain, families would rush home with a copy, and someone, usually papa or mama, would read it to the enthralled family. There's a famous engraving showing papa reading The Death of Little Nell to his family, and everyone's in tears. The children are absolutely in hysterics. But, you know, this was the effect, and it was through the spoken language. And of course, Dickens and many other authors went on stage to read from their written works. If anything, that was what killed Dickens, because it was such an exhausting job. The print culture of the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, was the result of the printing press, which opened literacy to a far broader population. Printing was an enormous cultural shock, and it took centuries to assimilate its effects. In the 20th and 21st centuries, more shocks were to arrive. Now I'm going to launch us from the conquest of the Americas to the middle of the 20th century. The Second World War has ended in victory for the Americans and their allies, a victory thanks in large part to education. Armies have always been schools as well, but the armies that won the war were among the finest educational institutions the world had ever seen, and their graduates were masters of logistics, technology, and a range of skills that would serve them well in peacetime. One of the first demands that Canadians and Americans made on their peacetime governments was better access to education. They wanted their kids to get at least through high school, and if possible to go on to some kind of post-secondary. Veterans, most of them old enough to remember the dirty 30s very well, wanted more education and got it. In both Canada and the US, community colleges and public universities found themselves teaching teenagers and people in their 30s in the same classroom, and the demand did not ease. If anything, it increased as young families began the baby boom, which lasted for 20 glorious years. Free public education had been theoretically available for many years, but in practice, Many children had had to drop out for economic reasons, especially in the Depression. Some of those dropouts had made up for it by going back to school after the war, and all parents wanted a better life for their kids than the one they had known. Education was critical, and dropouts were considered failures of the system. So political pressure was intense to build more schools, more colleges, more universities. They still offered some trades training, but the emphasis was always on college prep, getting the kids ready for post-secondary and upper middle class professional occupations. To give you a sense of how rapid the growth in education was, I consulted Perplexity.ai, which is it's an AI-enhanced search engine. And I asked it, what percentage of Canadians were post-secondary graduates in 1950, 1960, and 2000? Perplexity told me that just 6% of Canadians were enrolled in post-secondary in 1950. So the percentage of graduates would have been somewhere between 5 and 8%. In 1960, 11.9% of the population aged 15 or more had graduated from some kind of post-secondary, with men slightly ahead at 12.5% and women at 11.2%. In 2000, 38.2% of us had a post-secondary credential. And this year, 2025, 63% of Canadians aged 15 to 64 have achieved a post-secondary credential of some kind. And that's the highest proportion in all the G7 nations. I was born in 1941, which makes me a war baby. And it was my demographic that benefited the most from the education boom after the war. While we were still in high schools, the Russians did something wonderful for us all. They launched Sputnik. 1957, beep, 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 beep. And the American government and the Canadians close behind absolutely panicked, because this was clearly an area where the Russians had no business being ahead of us. So what they did was simply to throw lots of money at the problem. The problem was supposedly the airheads in the public schools of North America. So money came pouring in for expanding programs, for scholarships and so forth, and that meant that kids like me could take advantage of more scholarships to more universities, and we graduated just as the first baby boomers were entering high school in the early 1960s. I started my teaching career in 1967 at the old VCC King Edward High campus. Remember that, before it burned down? Which was then just 2 years old. And I moved the next year to the brand new Capilano College on the North Shore. VCC was in an old high school building. Cap was in a new high school building. We didn't know it yet, but the baby boom was over. But who cared? The last of the boomers wouldn't arrive in our classrooms until the mid-1980s. So students arrived in their hundreds and their thousands, and we taught them, and we had a great time doing it. But the education they got was classic Sumerian style. At VCC, in those repurposed high schools classrooms, the desks were still on rails. Hard to imagine, but yeah, that dates me. They got what I learned to call full frontal teaching. Someone standing in front of them, lecturing, explaining, and scrawling on a chalkboard, just as we war babies had been taught. But something else was going on that would make our students very different from ourselves. Movies had been a staple of cultural life from the early years of the century. My grandfather once told me that he had gone as a boy, from Jersey City to New York to see a moving picture show. This would have been about 1899, 1900. And when he went back to Jersey City, the kids didn't believe him. He ended up being in 139 movies. Every home had had a radio since the 1930s, and by the early 1950s, Canada was broadcasting TV. And a lot of Canadians living near the border were already tuning in to American stations. That was a big deal. And I can remember when I taught in Guangzhou in 1983, all the apartment buildings and some of the university classroom buildings had these, what they call fishbone antennas. And they were great big monster TV antennas, but they would keep it down on the floor, out of sight until dark. Then they'd go up and they could pick up Hong Kong TV. And they were recording everything they could off that. So, pretty powerful influence. So by the 1960s, movies, radio, and TV were beginning to replicate the collective experiences our Stone Age ancestors had had, sitting around their campfires. They were watching and hearing stories about heroes, about the great forces that ruled the world, and about how to enjoy life. Print-based education found itself competing against a revived oral education, complete with singing and dancing and dramatic stories. I could see the kids mentally changing channels right in my classroom, looking for something, anything, more interesting than me explaining essay structure or subject-verb agreement. And eventually I included my teaching to include lots of jokes and sometimes something kind of gross, which would wake them up, and I'd get 10 seconds to explain semicolons. And in hindsight, I can see that my teaching was most effective when I sat down with individual students and went over their writing with them, one-to-one, line by line. Not many of us had that opportunity, but I had it. And now, in hindsight, I can see I was teaching them how to chip flint into arrowheads. Meanwhile, demographics began to catch up with us. As the baby boomers tapered off in the late 1970s and early 1980s, married women began to turn up in growing numbers. The reason was simple. We had stagflation and then recession, and the neoliberals were getting entrenched. So the households needed a second income. Think about that too. You know, my generation had dad making the money, mom looking after the home, and you could send the kids to college on what dad made and buy a house. And it wasn't that way anymore after the 80s. So the mature women needed a second income just to stay above water, so they were going back to school. We also began to see younger women in previously all-male bastions like business management. Oh, it was so wonderful when the older women got into business management and they sorted out the 18-year-old idiots in the back row. And life got so much better. And everyone became more serious about their education because so many college grads were already out in the labor force, so that a degree or a diploma was becoming just a lottery ticket. It might get you an interview, but it didn't mean a guaranteed job anymore. And at some point, government funding for education began to fall behind the demand. Tuition began to rise. International students, who were a novelty in the 1980s, became essential in the 1990s. By paying the full cost of tuition, the internationals subsidized Canadian resident students. A lot of school districts began to recruit internationals as well, for a very simple reason. If you get your kid into a BC high school and they get a Dogwood certificate, they can go in at their normal tuition rate for a Canadian post-secondary. And at the post-secondary level, we began aggressively recruiting students in Japan and South Korea and China. Our deans at CAP were at every education fair in the Far East, year after year, trying to drum up business. And then a new competitor for student attention made itself known. In a Sumerian classroom, it's just the teacher and the students. In Canadian classrooms, it's now the teacher, the students, and the internet. By the time I retired in 2008, most of my students have laptops. And I confess that when I came in a little earlier today, and I saw you here and all the laptops on the table, my heart sank. It was just an awful flashback. I had tried to exploit the laptops by challenging students to find information online instead of in their heads, and the results were doubtful at best. And it was even worse in 2010. I'd retired, but then I became a retread at another college when a teacher fell ill and would be out for the semester. And okay, I went in, I was going to teach business writing and all that stuff, but the prof had said, no phones in class. And that was as close as I ever got to a communist revolution breaking out in one of my classrooms. It was very unpleasant. So I finally, we worked something out, but it was not a very, very happy experience. And this was 3 years after Steve Jobs had introduced the iPhone, and my students were already deeply addicted. And yes, I noticed that you were asked to turn off your phones before I came up here. So anyway, I was glad when the semester ended and I could go back to walking my dogs and Googling information for writing articles for the Tyee. And now we've got AI. I explored ChatGPT just after it came out, and I even wrote a Tyee piece about it. And I will confide to you what I didn't say in the Tyee article. Its first replies to me sounded like the quality bullshit that any good English major can produce on demand, because I used to produce it. But it also made me consider some of the issues I've been discussing this morning. Writing was a way of fixing information so any literate person could access it. But as we came to depend on it, our powers of memorization began to fade. Oral culture survived among the illiterate, but literacy offered a way out of poverty, and eventually we all took it. With the loss of oral culture, we also lost our powers of speech and argument. The least popular parts of my courses were the public speaking ones. A whole generation fought in Europe to guarantee freedom of speech for a bunch of kids who were terrified to stand up in class. From Aristotle's time to our own, rhetoric has been a technical subject for specialists, not a means of expression for everyone. And now artificial intelligence seems poised to make natural intelligence obsolete. Computers in the classroom taught us to think less about the right answers and more about the right questions. And now, if you ask an AI chatbot, what are the best ways to phrase a question for you, you'll get a detailed answer, and perhaps some follow-up questions you were too dumb to think about. At this point, you may be expecting some pessimistic conclusion, but I don't have one. Actually, I owe you thanks for inviting me to talk about this, because as I put the speech together, I've come to understand something. I mentioned our ancestors teaching each other in small groups and doing it so well that given technologies could be passed down intact through many generations. And I mentioned how at night they must have gathered around a campfire, talking and singing and arguing, pass along stories about their parents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents. Any further back than that, and the ancestors became mythical superhumans or even gods. That image of a collective around a campfire, teaching and learning, has stuck with me. And while writing this speech, I've come to realize that our modern media function the same way. Instead of a campfire, though, we have a movie screen, or a radio, or a laptop, or a smartphone. The screen is our campfire. And the collective who gather around the screen are teaching and learning all the time. No doubt our ancestors taught and learned a lot of nonsense, along with how to chip a flint arrowhead, and the same is true of us. Nevertheless, if we can find the right questions, we may be able to stumble our way to better answers and to assimilate AI into human life instead of merely obeying its answers. Our ancestors around the campfire talked their way out of some very bad situations by drawing on their collective knowledge. And I believe our children will be able to do the same. Thank you again. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to try to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
If you could make up a list of 10 books that would be must-read, it would make a very interesting discussion.
Well, I mentioned some of the ones here. I'm sorry. If I could make a list of 10 books as must-reads, what would they be? Well, actually, I've got a kind of a racket going with the Tyee, where
How much does it cost?
the Tyee doesn't cost anything. But the Tyee doesn't cost anything unless you want to support it. But they pay me to write reviews of books I'm interested in. If I don't like a book, I won't waste time on it. But I do find book after book that they let me review is really something exciting, eye-opening, scary, what have you. So I just wrote a review of a book called Breakneck: How China is Engineering the Future. Wow, that was an eye-opener. So, check me out in the Tyee, and you'll see what the books I think are must-reads. Thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, next. Thanks. Hi. I'm just interested in AI in terms of groupthink. And so if everybody's asking a similar version of a question and getting sort of the same answer, first of all, I worry that people stop thinking for themselves or start projecting to wondering what else somebody else might say because they take it as the God-given truth. And then, of course, that also leads to, I'm presuming, a lot of plagiarism in terms of people writing papers in university and even articles for newspapers. So I'm a bit skeptical of the version of AI myself. I have some more problems with it than I see positives. And I'm wondering if I'm being too pessimistic or there's more value to it than I see.
I may be biased by something I wrote in the 1980s. I wrote a YA novel called Brother Jonathan about a late 21st century society where everyone consults Turings, artificial intelligences with their own faces and personalities. They come up on the screen like anybody else, and in fact, I was predicting tablets. I didn't know it, but they were. And they would give you advice. You unburden yourself to them, and they tell you what to do. And I saw them as basically benign. But clearly, other people think, anyone who builds it will kill everyone else. And that's not so good. But I think it's there. We're going to have to live with it. And I think some of us will be able to outwit even the brightest artificial intelligence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, David.
That was terrific. Really enjoyed it. And,
Great.
I'm very indebted to you.
Thank you.
Have a seat.
Okay.